3 years ago, I was doing what almost every woman is told to do after menopause. I was eating less, trying to stay active, forcing myself to work out, and telling myself that if I just stayed disciplined long enough, the weight would finally come off. But it didn't. The fat around my waist would not move. Not a little. Not slowly. Just not at all. And that was the part that started messing with me mentally, because I wasn't sitting on the couch doing nothing. I was trying. I was making the effort. But the old advice that used to work earlier in life suddenly felt useless. Eat less. Move more. Add more cardio. Be more consistent. I was already doing those things, and all it did was leave me more tired, more inflamed, more hungry, and more frustrated. I didn't look better. I just felt like I was fighting my body harder and losing. That was the moment everything changed for me, because I finally understood something I wish more women were told sooner. After menopause, stubborn fat is usually not just a motivation problem or a willpower problem. It becomes a signaling problem. That one shift changed the way I looked at fat loss completely. I didn't lose 20 pounds after menopause by becoming more extreme. I lost it by changing the internal conditions that were making my body resist change in the first place. And in this video, I want to walk you through my exact peptide routine, not in a vague biohacking way, but in the actual order I thought about it, what I focused on first, what I refused to rush into, and why the peptide that speeds things up should not be the first thing most women reach for. Because the truth is, I did not start with the most aggressive fat loss tool, and that decision made all the difference. What I eventually learned is that my routine was really built around 3 layers. First, I needed better recovery and a better hormonal rhythm. Then I needed better appetite control and metabolic structure. And only after that did I focus on improving energy efficiency and fat loss cooperation at the cellular level. Once those 3 layers started working together, the fat loss stopped feeling like punishment and finally started feeling sustainable. That was the real turning point. The reason this matters so much after menopause is because your body is no longer responding under the same conditions it did in your 20s or even your 30s. Sleep often gets lighter. Recovery gets worse. Stress hits harder. Insulin sensitivity can decline. It becomes easier to lose muscle and harder to rebuild it. And the fat that shows up around the midsection tends to become far more stubborn than it used to be. So a lot of women react the way I did at first. They push harder. They cut more calories. They add more cardio. They become more controlling with food. But if your sleep is off, your cravings are harder to manage, your stress is elevated, and your body is holding on to energy more defensively, that strategy usually backfires. You don't just get stuck. You start feeling worse. That is why I stopped asking, what burns the most fat the fastest? And started asking, what is making my body resist fat loss so aggressively right now? That question led me to peptides. Not because peptides are magic, and not because they replace protein, sleep, walking, lifting, or a calorie deficit. They do not. But the right peptide strategy can make your body more cooperative. And when your body starts cooperating again, the fundamentals finally begin working the way they are supposed to. So here is the exact structure I used. The first thing I focused on was recovery. That came before aggressive fat loss. And I think this is where many women get it wrong. When you are uncomfortable in your body, it is very tempting to chase speed. You want something powerful. You want something dramatic. You want the scale to move right now. But after menopause, the smarter question is often not, what can suppress my appetite the most? The smarter question is, what will make my body less chaotic, less inflamed, less stressed, and more able to recover? For me, that is where Ipamorelin came in. I did not use Ipamorelin as a fat burner. I used it as a recovery and rhythm tool. That distinction matters. One of the hidden problems after menopause is that everything starts getting noisier. Your sleep is less restorative. Your recovery is less predictable. Your body feels puffier. Your cravings feel harder to manage. Your energy feels less stable. And when all of that is happening at the same time, fat loss becomes much harder than people realize. What I noticed first with this part of the routine was not dramatic weight loss. It was that my body felt less noisy. I slept deeper. I recovered better. I felt less run down after training. I looked less inflamed. My face looked less puffy. My body looked less stressed. That may not sound dramatic to someone chasing a fast transformation, but for women after menopause, that kind of change is often the beginning of visible fat loss. Because when sleep improves, recovery improves, and you hold on to more lean tissue while dieting, your body starts behaving differently. You train better. You feel steadier. You stop looking like you are surviving your own routine. That was my first signal that things were finally moving in the right direction. And that brings me to the second layer, which was the one that changed the pace of my results. That was Retatrutide. This is where I want to be very careful, because this is the part most people get overly excited about. Yes, appetite control peptides can be powerful. Yes, they can make it dramatically easier to stay in a calorie deficit. Yes, they can reduce food noise in a way that feels completely different from white-knuckling your way through a diet. But powerful does not mean effortless, and it definitely does not mean harmless if you use it carelessly. The mistake a lot of women make is thinking that if appetite drops, the answer is simply to eat as little as possible. But a smaller appetite is not the same thing as a better body. If protein drops too low, if resistance training is neglected, if sleep is poor, and if energy intake crashes too hard, the result can be a smaller body that also looks flatter, softer, weaker, and more depleted. That was never my goal. I did not want to just become lighter. I wanted to become leaner, tighter, stronger, and more in control. So when I introduced this second layer, I used it to create structure, not chaos. It helped me stay consistent with a deficit without feeling constantly preoccupied with food. It helped reduce the internal noise around hunger. It made discipline easier to maintain. But I still treated protein, lifting, hydration, and sleep like non-negotiables. That is the difference between using a strong tool intelligently and simply shrinking yourself. And that is why I said earlier that the peptide that speeds things up should not be the first thing most women reach for. If your body is already under-recovered, under-muscled, underslept, and overstressed, aggressive appetite suppression can make the situation worse, not better. You may lose weight, but not in the way you actually want. That is why my routine did not begin there. The third layer was MOTS-c, and this part interested me because it addressed something many women feel after menopause but struggle to explain. It is not always just hunger. Sometimes it feels like your whole energy system has changed. You crash harder. You feel more carb-dependent. Your body feels less flexible. Workouts feel heavier. Your metabolism feels less responsive. Even when you are doing everything right, your body still feels sluggish and resistant. That is what made MOTS-c so interesting to me. I did not think of it as a miracle compound. I thought of it as an efficiency tool. The best way I can describe it is that this part of the routine made my system feel more cooperative. My energy felt steadier. My training felt more productive. I did not feel as stuck. And when energy becomes more stable, everything downstream gets easier. You move more naturally, train with better quality, recover with less resistance, and stay more consistent without feeling like every day is a grind. So if I summarize the routine clearly, this is exactly how I thought about it. I started by supporting recovery and hormonal rhythm. Then I focused on appetite control and metabolic structure. Then I added support for energy efficiency and fat loss cooperation. That sequence mattered more than people realize. And I want to pause here and say something important, because this is where I think the credibility of this conversation either holds up or falls apart. I did not lose 20 pounds. because peptides did all the work for me. I lost 20 pounds because peptides finally made the fundamentals work again. They made it easier to hit protein consistently. They made lifting feel productive instead of punishing. They made it easier to keep a calorie deficit without obsessing over food all day. They supported better recovery. They reduced some of the friction that had been making my body feel like it was resisting me at every step. That is very different from a magic fix. And honestly, I think that is why so many women after menopause feel broken. They are trying to force results with strategies that no longer match the biology they are dealing with. Then, when those strategies fail, they blame themselves. They assume they are lazy, weak, inconsistent, or doing something wrong. But often the real issue is that they are trying to solve a signaling problem with more punishment. That was me for a long time. Once I stopped trying to outwork my biology and started supporting it instead, everything became more sustainable. Not overnight. Not perfectly. But consistently enough that the body finally started changing. If I had to do it all over again, there are a few things I would absolutely not do. I would not start with the most aggressive appetite-suppressing option first. I would not undereat just because it suddenly became easier to eat less. I would not skip resistance training and hope the scale alone would tell the full story. And I would not stack random compounds just because they all sounded promising on paper. More compounds does not mean better results. Better sequencing usually matters much more. If anything, one of the biggest lessons from this whole experience was that panic makes people stack, but intelligence makes people sequence. After menopause, fat loss does not respond well to panic. It responds much better to structure. And the emotional payoff of that was bigger than the number on the scale. Of course, losing 20 pounds mattered. Of course, seeing my waist change mattered. Of course, feeling leaner and more comfortable in my body mattered. But the biggest relief was realizing that my body was not broken and that I was not failing. I was simply using the wrong strategy for the stage of life I was in. That realization changes everything, because once you stop attacking yourself, you can finally start building a system that works with you instead of against you. So when people ask me what my exact peptide routine was, the most honest answer is this. It was not just 3 compounds. It was a sequence. It was recovery first, control second, efficiency third. It was using peptides to reduce friction so that sleep, protein, lifting, walking, and consistency could finally do their job again. That is what changed my body. If you are in menopause or postmenopause and you feel like your old fat loss methods stopped working, that is exactly who this channel is for. Make these videos for women who want to understand what is actually happening with hormones, recovery, appetite, body composition, and peptides, without all the hype and without the usual just try harder nonsense. So subscribe if you want more grounded, menopause-focused peptide education. And if you want, comment routine below, because in the next video I can break down exactly how I supported this with training, protein, walking, recovery, and the habits that made the peptide side actually work. I did not lose 20 pounds after menopause by becoming more extreme. I lost it by finally working with my biology instead of against it. Because stubborn fat loss after menopause is not just about eating less. It is about fixing the signal,